All right, let's jump right into this explainer and unravel one of the absolute most fascinating paradoxes in modern economic history. When we think about the 1930s, we usually picture this decade of pure misery, right? Breadlines, unemployment, just absolute despair. But what if I told you that for a huge chunk of the British population, that exact same decade was actually a time of unprecedented prosperity? We're talking shopping sprees and a massive boom in newly built homes. Today, we're going to dig into this two nations paradox and uncover what was really happening in Britain during the 1930s.
To figure out this paradox, we kind of have to start at rock bottom. Right after the Wall Street crash of 1929, some of the most brilliant minds of the time were painting a really grim picture. The politician J.H. Thomas called it a world economic blizzard. And the famous economist J.M. Keynes, well, he didn't mince words at all, literally calling it the greatest economic catastrophe of the modern world.
But here's the mystery we're going to solve. Amidst all this total panic, the bank failures, the skyrocketing unemployment, how on earth did Britain simultaneously experience a massive housing and consumer boom? Like, how does a catastrophe somehow actually elevate living standards for the majority of the country?
Let's trace how this disaster built up. It kicks off in 1929. The U.S. economy crashes, they immediately throw up high trade barriers, and bam! Britain's biggest export market is suddenly closed off. And because Britain was already drowning in war debts, losing that trade was just devastating. By 1931, the panic washes up on British shores. You've got bank failures, a literal run on the Bank of England as terrified investors pull their money out. And by 1932, this economic blizzard had completely frozen the country. Unemployment hit a staggering 2.6 million people.
Okay, to really get what happened next, we need to unpack some specific Tier 3 economic language. First up, the gold standard. Think of this as a monetary system where the value of a country's currency is directly tethered to actual physical gold. In 1931, Britain was trying so desperately to maintain this standard, but to do it, they had to keep interest rates sky high, and that basically just choked off any chance for domestic borrowing or investment.
Now, what is wild here is how a totally unrelated event just blew this entire system to pieces. In September 1931, naval troops up in Invergordon actually mutinied over government pay cuts. When foreign investors caught wind of this unrest, they completely panicked. They started pulling gold out of Britain at a rate of £2.5 million every single day. This basically forced the government's hand. They had to suspend the gold standard entirely, and the value of the pound instantly tanked from around $4.86 down to $3.40.
But here's the twist in the story. Free from the massive burden of defending the gold standard, the government introduced our next key term, cheap money. Because they didn't have to entice gold investors anymore, they slashed interest rates from 6% in 1931 down to just 2% in 1932. This is an absolute game changer. Suddenly, borrowing money became incredibly cheap for both struggling businesses and everyday consumers. So, you've got cheap money flowing into the system, right? But the government itself was deeply divided on what to do next. Unemployment was still a massive crisis, so what was the overarching strategy to actually fix the nation?
Looking at the political landscape, it was totally fractured into these competing historical perspectives. If we look at it neutrally, you had the orthodox view, led by Chancellor Snowdon, pushing for balanced budgets and slashing government spending. Keynes, on the other hand, wanted to do the exact opposite, borrow heavily to create jobs. Oswald Mosley was pitching a mix of borrowing, tariffs, and boosting pensions. And the extreme left, they argued capitalism itself was collapsing and the state just needed to take over all industry.
This brings us to another vital piece of Tier 3 vocabulary from that era, the multiplier effect. Keynes argued super passionately for this. His theory was that if the government borrowed money to pay workers for public projects, well, those workers would go spend their wages at local shops. That increases profits, which allows those shops to hire more people. The money literally multiplies as it moves, organically generating wealth and demand for everyone.
Meanwhile, over on the other side of the political aisle, the Conservatives were pushing hard for our next defined term, tariffs, also known as protectionism. A tariff is really just a tax slapped onto imported goods. The idea is that by making foreign goods artificially more expensive, you protect your own domestic farmers and factories from being undercut by cheaper foreign competition.
And wow, did this tariff debate fiercely divide the country. The Conservatives, led by Baldwin, saw tariffs as absolutely essential to stop foreign products from being dumped into Britain. The Labour Party fiercely opposed it, warning it would just drive up the cost of living for everyday people, suggesting import boards instead.
And interestingly, the conservative magazine The Spectator pointed out that in heavily protected France, steel production had actually dropped by 25%. So protectionism clearly wasn't a magic wand. Even so, the national government went ahead in 1932 and slapped a 10% general duty on imports.
So, the million-dollar question, did any of this actually work? Did a 10% tariff duty and cheap money truly save Britain, or was the reality on the ground being driven by something entirely different?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at this really striking geographical divide. Historians call it the two nations. Basically, your experience of the 1930s depended entirely on your zip code and what you did for a living. In the North and West, the old staple industries like coal, steel, and shipbuilding were in brutal decline. But shift your focus down to the South and East, like the Thames Valley, and you see booming service industries churning out cars, radios, and chemicals.
For the towns relying on those old staple industries, that catastrophe Keynes warned about, it was devastatingly real. Take Jarrow, for example, a town built on shipbuilding. Their unemployment hit a staggering 70%. To put that into perspective, 7 out of 10 people were completely out of work. It was this intense regional agony that drove 200 unemployed workers to organize the famous Jarrow March to London in 1936, just desperately pleading for jobs.
And that devastation in the North was actually made worse by our final Tier 3 term today, retrenchment. This was the government's super strict policy of slashing costs during tough times. To keep international confidence up in 1931, they cut wages for public workers like teachers and cops, and even slashed unemployment benefits. So, by taking money right out of people's pockets, retrenchment actually killed the total demand for goods at the exact moment the economy needed people to be spending.
But hang on. What about the other nation? Despite all this grim reality in the North, for the vast majority of the country, the interwar years were an era of genuine economic progress. But how is that possible? How on earth could real wages rise right in the middle of a global depression? It all comes down to a surprisingly simple economic equation. See, the global depression caused the prices of raw materials and food to totally plummet. So, everyday items got a lot cheaper. But for the people who managed to keep their jobs, their wages generally stayed the same. Cheaper goods plus steady wages equaled a massive, unexpected surge in purchasing power. Between 1924 and 1935, real wages, as a national average, jumped by an incredible 17%. Everyday paychecks were literally stretching further than ever before.
And let me tell you, people spent that extra cash. This newfound purchasing power kicked off a massive consumer boom, and nowhere is it more obvious than at the movies. People suddenly had disposable income for fun. In 1924, only about 36,000 people were going to the cinema. Fast forward to 1935, 8 million. That is a staggering jump. The British public was going out, seeking some escapism and spending their money.
Suddenly, millions were buying what they called mod cons, modern conveniences. Motor car output doubled, making Britain the second largest car maker in the entire world. Working-class women finally had the extra cash to buy into the cosmetics industry, picking up lipsticks and perfumes that used to be strictly for the rich. Tabloid newspapers and pro sports exploded in popularity, and electricity output actually quadrupled, powering up all these brand new gadgets. This massive surge in domestic demand perfectly canceled out the huge drop they'd seen in foreign exports.
And get this, it sparked an absolute housing revolution. While those old heavy industries were struggling, the construction sector was going gangbusters. 2.5 million brand new homes were built for private sale in the 1930s.
And it wasn't just private homes either. Local councils used government subsidies to start bulldozing overcrowded slums. They built new homes with indoor plumbing and hot running water, which were absolute luxuries back then, and rented them out for just 11 shillings a week. That's about 55 pence. Unbelievably affordable and a total game changer for working-class families.
When you look at the mechanics of this housing boom, you can see how everything we've talked about connects. Remember that cheap money policy we defined earlier? Well, that let banks offer highly affordable mortgages. An increase in building societies meant even folks with modest incomes could get a loan. The ever-expanding national grid provided electricity for all the new consumer gadgets inside these homes. And a social shift toward having smaller families freed up even more household income. It's crazy to think about, but by 1939, a full third of all the houses in the entire country were newly built.
So stepping back and looking at all this evidence from the explainer, we have to ask ourselves, what was the real root cause of the recovery?
Did politicians save the day with their tariffs and retrenchment? Or did the British people, armed with this newly increased purchasing power, basically just go shopping and buy houses, dragging the nation out of the slump themselves? The evidence strongly points to everyday consumer demand being the real hero here. Ultimately, the Hungry 30s weren't just this one monolithic story of despair. They were a deeply complex paradox, a tale of two very different nations. And it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. If one of the most severe economic depressions in human history actually sparked an unprecedented era of homeownership and consumer growth for the majority, well, how many other historical catastrophes are hiding a secret era of growth, just waiting to be uncovered?